thank all of you for being here today. For those of you that are regulars here, and I know we see a number of new faces here, but a number of you are regulars, you know that sometimes I go through the really onerous process of introducing Clay Jenkinson, but I'm not going to do that today so that we can get right into our topic. But please welcome Clay Jenkinson to our stage.
Oh, thanks. Can we come up with the lights a little?
Yeah. Joel, can we bring up a few lights so we can see some folks out here, if that's possible? Yeah, there you go. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So Clay.
Hi, Larry.
How you doing?
I'm fine. How are you?
We're doing fine. I thought really ironic today that we're going to talk about Thoreau, and for those folks here that are readers of the Clay Jenkinson column in the Bismarck Tribune, I'm sure that they read about the Keystone Pipeline today. And so at any rate, I just thought we would start off before we get into our real topic here today, and let's just talk about your column and some of the reaction that you've already gotten to that column. And so, what do you think?
Well, it is, of course, ironic to write such a column on the day that you're talking about Thoreau, because you can imagine what Thoreau would say about our consumptive habits and the implications of them for the environment and so on. But, you know, I didn't know that we were going to talk about this, so I'm not really very well prepared, but I could have written that column either way. I didn't know which way I was going to write it. I knew that I wanted to write about it, but I could easily have written reluctantly to say we shouldn't do it, just as well as reluctantly to say that we should do it. But I felt when I wrestled with it, I've done a lot of reading about it, and you know, you and I have talked about it at great length, and I've been at every website that you can see. And Bill McKibben, who's one of the national protesters who was actually arrested at the White House for a pretty significant protest against the Keystone Pipeline, he's a nature writer and an essayist. In fact, he has an annotated edition of Walden. He's married to a friend of mine that I studied with at Oxford. Most of my closest friends are people who are not in favor of the Keystone Pipeline. And so my instinct was my instinct before looking at it was to say, you know, we probably shouldn't do this. It's not good oil up there, and this is just one more way of sort of re-endorsing a carbon footprint that we know we have to start to address in a serious way. But then, so I have a lot of instinct along those lines. But I actually think that if, and I know this is going to sound controversial now, but if Thoreau were actually here to reason with us, he would. One of his arguments in Walden is, you have to face the implications of the way you live. And the way we live is to be a carbon glutton. I mean, there are no people on earth who are greater carbon gluttons than the people of the United States. And if you read any books about the nature of energy, you know that the carbon is the one and only one really easy form of energy. Can we come down just a little on the volume? It comes in cleaner and dirtier forms, natural gas on one end and dirty sorts of coal on the other end, but we're so addicted to carbon that there's not going to be any quick exit from it. That's the basis of, I think, the Thoreauvian basis for this. You have to face the implications of your lives. The way we live necessitates a certain industrial paradigm. And the tar sands of Alberta are not the world's ideal carbon by far, but they're unbelievably abundant. And they're in North America, and the Canadians are not going to stop developing those tar sands. They're going to go 100% forward. And if they don't sell them to us, they're going to sell them somewhere else. So from a strategic point of view, as the 21st century unfolds, our big quarrel is going to be with China, not with the Middle East. The Middle East is going to begin to fade from our national consciousness, and China is going to become more and more and more important. So anyway, I've probably spoken too long about this now, but I felt it would be intellectually dishonest for me to argue against the pipeline when my way of life is such that I'm basically voting for it hour after hour, day after day in the way that I live, however much I might want not to vote for it politically, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Well, my issue is, first I agree with you, we're completely dependent on carbon. We know that. There's a documentary coming out. I got to see a preview of it, and it's called Switch. And the idea of switch is what happens when we make the switch from the carbon that we use to other sources, renewable sources or whatever they might be, those other sources that don't use carbon. And the guy that did the movie, the producer of the movie, and he's an academic, he actually wrote it and produced it and did all that stuff. But he his going in argument was on any sort of energy, how many people does it actually serve each in a year? And he factored in nuclear and wind and ethanol and all of these things. And he basically said to serve the global world that's expanding and actually becoming far more dependent on carbon, the number of cars in China and India that are just exploding in numbers are becoming far more dependent on petroleum products. And he said if we pulled out all the stops on producing renewables or alternative fuels, it would be 2064 before those fuels could make up half of what we require in the world. So 2064 before we get to a point where half of our needs will be met by carbon products.
By non-carbon products.
Yeah, well, it'd be 50-50 then, right? So 2064, if we pull out all the stops, then the issue is, okay, so if we're that dependent on carbon, which I think we are, everything from our plastics to our fertilizers to the way that we transport ourselves around the country, all of this is dependent on carbon. So if that's the case, then where do you get it? And right now, we get an overabundance of that from a place that has caused us much heartache and many problems in the Middle East. You know, we're in the Middle East for two reasons. We know that, and the number one reason is carbon. It's oil. Is access to oil, and so we fought two wars now in the Middle East to ensure our access to those oil sources. So I fall on the line that if we're going to use carbon, why wouldn't you want to buy it from your best friend?
Well, because it's dirty carbon. You know, when you sink a drill in the Middle East into Saudi oil, once the well is down there, it's easy to pump the oil out and you get an enormous amount of BTU for the input that goes in. Mm-hmm. And it's good oil. It's, as carbons go, it's much cleaner. To get the oil out of the tar sands, you have to strip mine it. You have to put an enormous amount of BTUs in just to get it into the state where you can transform it into oil, and the oil it's transformed into is not particularly clean oil, and it has a huge carbon footprint. And so if you could do without it, you would want to do without it. In other words,
that's a big if.
Of desirable carbons, it's not a very desirable carbon. But it's an incredibly abundant carbon, and the Canadians are working hard to try to make the cleanest footprint they can of it. But I think we should move on to our man here.
Yeah. But it is, you have to admit, just because we can the Saudis can put a hole in the ground and get this oil, that it's not a very dependable source of carbon for us.
No, and we've gone beyond peak. But if you just create a little spectrum, on one end you would put the dirtiest sort of coal, on the other end you'd have, say, natural gas. The Bakken is somewhere in the middle. The Bakken is also expensive oil to get out of the ground, and there's a lot of environmental uncertainty about what it means, but it's way cleaner and less industrially gigantic than the tar sands. The tar sands are really, you have to put about 60 BTUs into the ground for every 100 BTUs you pull out, and so it's not ideal by any means, and it's one of those hard choices that you have to make. And let me just close this by just saying what I resent is the way our politicians deliberately and hopelessly oversimplify these hard questions. These are really hard questions, and we have to wrestle with them. What kind of a future do we want? What's our relationship with the biosphere? What's our relationship with global climate change? How will this affect our daily ways of living, our prosperity, jobs, etc.? These are incredibly complex questions, and to say, well, we should do this because it's a shovel-ready project and it's jobs, 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 seems to me to be kind of a pathetic oversimplification of a really hard issue. Or to say we shouldn't do this because it's because as Bill McKibben says, that's like voting for the death of the planet. That seems to me to be a hopeless oversimplification too. And so the truth is going to be a really unpleasant, messy truth somewhere in the middle. And I don't have any conviction that I'm right about this, but I wanted to get a conversation started about it that wasn't a talking points conversation, if that makes any sense.
Right.
Anyway, let's move on.
Should we move on? Okay, well, let's start off with Thoreau then.
Shown here.
And by the way, when we get to the end, if you've got any questions for Clay on that topic.
And people disagree with me, and that's
Yeah.
fine. And I disagree with me. I don't even know what I believe. I just know that I'm addicted to carbon. I don't know about you, but you look like you are.
I am. Okay, so the way we want to do this is we want to start off and sort of putting Thoreau in historical context and talk about who he was and what he actually did before we actually get into the book itself and start talking about the points of the book. So why don't you get us started with that? Or do you want me to do this first?
I think you should just quickly say what's coming.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll do this. This is sort of an advertisement for February 26th. We're going to talk about changing interpretations of Western and actually Native American history. And I'm really excited. Dr. Herman Viola is coming to spend some time on our campus, and he's going to spend that Sunday here with us. And Dr. Viola is retired. He's a director emeritus at the Smithsonian Institute, where he ran the anthropological archives for many, many years. He's produced a number of books, and I brought, this is just a sampling of books that he has written on particularly Native American history and Western history. Thomas McKinney was a very, very long time serving Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and he wrote a book on him. He wrote a book on Ben Nighthorse Campbell, who you'll remember was a senator from the state of Colorado, Native American. And I brought both the hardback and the paperback because he's shown with his motorcycle on the paperback. I was once at a restaurant in Arizona, and these bikers pulled up, and you know, you're thinking, oh boy, here comes a bunch of bikers in to come, you know, kick us out of this restaurant. And one was United States Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell, who just happened to be wearing his leathers and rode his motorcycle in. Herman has edited the Commissioners of Indian Affairs, wonderful book, Diplomats in Buckskin. If you've never read that book, it's about the Indian delegations that went to Washington, D.C. to visit the Great Father, and there's wonderful stories about what happened there. These great tabletop books, Exploring the American West. Seeds of Change. Dr. Viola ran the national 500th anniversary of the exploration, 1492, of Columbus landing in the Western Hemisphere. A marvelous book on that. The Little Bighorn Remembered is a book that obviously about the Little Bighorn, but from the Indian side, the Indian perspective on what happened to Little Bighorn. I'm going to disappear under all these books. But what he's coming here to talk to us about really are two things. He's going to give a presentation on this book, which is called Warriors in Uniform. And it's about the Native Americans that have served the United States since our War of Independence with Great Britain, right up to today in Iraq and Afghanistan. And Herman has done a marvelous job of bringing their stories to print, and he's going to start off with a presentation on this book, and then we're going to sit down, and the three of us are going to have a discussion about the changing interpretations of Western history and Native American history. And so I hope all of you will come join us, and that's on February 26th. How was that for an
That was great, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to move these. So you're going to talk to us now about Thoreau.
Well, first of all, let me just say something very personally. I mean, one of the things that is a connection between the two of us is our love of Walden, which you wouldn't necessarily have expected, but we both love this book. And you know, in my hierarchy of American books, Walden ranks at the very top. I mean, if you think of books like Moby Dick and Huckleberry Finn and Willa Cather's My Antonia and Their Eyes Were Watching God, the poetry of Emily Dickinson, I mean, on and on and on. America has an incredibly rich literature, but for my taste, if there were one and only one book that you had to keep and everything else you had to let go, I would keep Walden. And I think Walden is an enormously important book, but personally, it's a book that speaks to me, and really it's about taste. For some people, Shakespearean comedy speaks to them, but not Shakespearean tragedy, and the other way around. Some people love Bach, but not particularly John Cage. or some people prefer Picasso and not Raphael. I mean, people have tastes, and their tastes are as wide as there is literature and art. And so Thoreau is not for everybody. Not everyone loves Thoreau. But I think Thoreau is, for me, the author, the American author who gets in, who speaks to me again and again. And what I noticed, and I think you noticed the same thing in rereading it, this is probably the 20th time I've read it. I first read it in high school. It's a classic, and one definition of a classic is greatly new every time you read it. So, you read it and it speaks to you in one way when you're 18, then you read it when you're 56 years old, and it speaks to you in a new way. And so a great book has this capacity to continue to bring discovery to you in the process of wrestling with it every time you come at it. If you read a Tom Clancy novel, and I mean no disrespect to Tom Clancy, but if you read it, you probably don't need to read it 5 times because you've gotten from it what you're going to get. But a book like this just never stops delivering if it's your sort of thing.
Right.
What about you?
No, I agree with you. I have not read it 25 times.
You're young, though.
Yeah, yeah, right. But I have found, in the half a dozen times that I've read it, that you end up I'm a great one for marking up my books. I underline, I put asterisks next to things. And I find out every time I read the book, I end up doing that with a different sentence or a different passage. So, my goodness, last time I read that, I missed that. And for some reason, and so I agree with you. That makes it a classic, and it makes it fun to go back and read it again. And you don't have to read the whole thing again. You might want to go back and just read the chapter on reading, for example. So we're in complete accord.
But maybe we could just start by looking at a passage. If you have your handouts, it's the one with the snowflake. Thoreau is most well known for having published Walden in 1854. He lived from 1817 to 1862. He died at the age of 44, a very young man, died of complications from tuberculosis. And he also caught sort of pneumonia or something when he was out rambling in a sleet storm. But he lived a short life. He wrote journals all of his life, beginning at the time that he met his mentor Emerson. And his journals are not much read anymore, partly because they're so long. They're 2 million words, which is twice the length of the Bible. And so it's hard to sit down for a weekend and read the journals of Thoreau. So he's mostly known today for some short essays on civil disobedience, which has had unbelievable influence around the world on Martin Luther King, on Mahatma Gandhi, and others. He's known for his defense of John Brown, the rabble-rouser who helped to touch off the Civil War. He has a great essay called Life Without Principle about, it really comes out of the same themes as Walden, but what are you giving your soul to? It's sort of that based on that biblical phrase that where your heart is, where your treasure is, your heart is too. And Thoreau's view is that whatever is really occupying your soul is what your value system is, whatever you might tell people around you. And then he has an essay on walking, which is sort of a favorite amongst people who love walking. So the lesser works of Thoreau are the most read, but the journal is the great work, and he used it as a mine to create parts of Walden. And parts of Walden are adaptations of passages in the journals. But I just wanted to look at this one because I have a photograph on it of a snowflake. This morning when I woke up, it felt so appropriate because it was like a New England morning here in Bismarck. The snow was coming down, there was no wind, the flakes were huge. It felt like Robert Frost and Thoreau had delivered this morning to us here on the Great Plains. And it reminded me, and so I scrambled to find it in the journals, of a famous passage he wrote on snowflakes. And so if you have it in front of you, you can follow along. But I just wanted to go through it, partly because of the snow this morning, but partly because to show you the quality of Thoreau as a writer. He has arguments against industrial civilization, and he's a mirror that's held up to you to help you decide who you are and what you value and what you give your time to. And he has a critique of American bourgeois consumerist values and so on. But at the basis of Thoreau is this unbelievably great writer. And he wrote about nature as well as anyone has ever written about nature in the history of writing. So let's just go through this. Nature is full of genius, full of the divinity, so that not a snowflake escapes its fashioning hand. Nothing is cheap and coarse, neither dewdrops nor snowflakes. Soon the storm increases. It was already very severe to face, and the snow comes finer, more white and powdery. Who knows but this is the original form of all snowflakes, but that when I observe these crystals falling around me, they are but just generated in the low mist next the earth. A divinity must have stirred within them before the crystals did thus shoot and set, wheels of storm chariots. The same law that shapes the earth star shapes the snow star. As surely as the petals of a flower are fixed each with the countless snow stars coming whirling to earth, pronouncing thus, with emphasis, the number 6. Order, cosmos. The Greek word cosmos means the cosmos, but also order. On the Saskatchewan, when no man of science is there to behold, still down they come, and not the less fulfill their destiny, perchance melt at once on the Indian's face. What a world we live in, where myriads of these little discs, so beautiful to the most prying eye, are whirled down on every traveler's coat, the observant and the unobservant, and on the restless squirrel's face, and on the far-stretching fields and forests, the wooded dells, and the mountaintops. Far, far away from the haunts of man, they roll down some little slope, fall over and come to their bearings, and melt or lose their beauty in the mass, ready anon to swell some little rill with their contribution, and so at the last the universal ocean from which they came. There they lie, like the wreck of chariot wheels after a battle in the skies. Meanwhile, the meadow mouse shoves them aside in his gallery, the schoolboy casts them in his snowball, or the woodman's sled glides smoothly over them, these glorious spangles, the sweeping of heaven's floor, and they all sing, melting as they sing of the mysteries of the number 6, 6, 6, 6. Is that great? I mean, look at this. This is a photograph of a snow crystal that I just pulled off the internet. Every snow crystal in the universe is unique, but they all have 6 sides. And you can't, I mean, he's just saying, if you look closely enough, you cannot fail to see the miracle of the universe, that anywhere you look, from a muskrat's behavior to a snowflake to a raindrop to the bean that comes up over the crust of the ground in the spring, it's just miracles in every direction. And the only thing that makes us not see the miracles is that we're so busy in habits, rushing around, keeping our eyes fixed to something that doesn't matter, that we fail to go observe this. And I don't know about you, Larry, but every time I have allowed myself to observe the world, I've come to the same conclusion at a much lower level of poetry. But he's absolutely right that it's unbelievably ingenious in every direction, and that, you know, he's taking a lot of this from Eastern Buddhism and Hinduism. He was one of the first Americans to be really deep into the Eastern tradition. He read the Bhagavad Gita and thought it was the best book in the world. And these Eastern religions equally say that life is identically miraculous no matter how you look at it, if you only can get the right lens to look at it. And so Thoreau is alive to that, and by writing about it, he makes us appreciate, when you go home tonight, just look at the snow on the ground, and think of that however many billions have fallen on Bismarck in the last 7 hours, every snowflake is 6-sided and unique in the universe.
Thus the experiment.
That's his experiment.
Right.
Right.
So we should get into the experiment.
There are his dates. Here, look at how much he aged in the last year of his life. He lived just till 1862. He died just when the Civil War was ravishing America. His mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, he lived with Emerson for much of his life. He was Emerson's editorial assistant in many things. Emerson helped to promote his career. Thoreau was a hard man to like. He was an eccentric. He was kind of a hermit. He was a kind of a freak. He rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because he was a little righteous about what he saw around him. he was odd. And so Emerson sort of said, he's odd, but he's okay. And that helped Thoreau along.
Why would you use the term freak?
Because he did things that other people don't. He went to jail. He was against slavery. He was 100% abolitionist, and against slavery and against the James Polk's war with Mexico, which, as you know, was an entirely voluntary and unnecessary war. It was a war of purely a land grab war. And so Thoreau didn't pay his poll taxes. Poll tax is a head tax. Every person has to pay a poll tax of $3 or $4 a year at that time. They've been outlawed by the Constitution of the United States now, but he didn't pay his poll tax for, I think, 6 years running as a protest against American policy. And he eventually was arrested. It's a famous story. Everyone knows that he was arrested, and he spent one night in jail. And then his aunt paid his back taxes. He did not want her to, but I'm sure he was glad that she did. She paid his back taxes, so he spent one night in jail, and Emerson came along while Thoreau was in jail. This may or may not be a true story, but it's a famous story. Emerson comes along and says to Thoreau, "Henry, what are you doing in there?" And Thoreau says, "Mr. Emerson, what are you doing out there?" And so, I mean, this kind of rubs some people the wrong way, this sort of righteousness, the quirkiness of him. He also made a terrible mistake. It's on your timeline. You know, we associate him with Walden and being one of America's first great environmentalists, but he actually burned by accident 300 acres of the woods at Walden. He and a friend were out playing in the woods, and they started a fire and burned 300 acres, which is a lot in New England, of Walden woods. And some people could never quite take him seriously after that as an environmentalist.
Let's go back to his one day in jail.
Yes, sir.
Just quickly. I don't know if ironic's the right term or unfair or what it is, but he's gotten a lot of mileage out of disobedience and going to jail by being disobedient, civil disobedience. Do you think from a historical point of view that we've created something that didn't really exist? I mean, one night in jail is not a lot. You've probably spent one night in jail.
As a matter of fact, I haven't, thank you very much, but we would have the same story. I'd say, "Larry, what are you doing out there?" And you'd say, "Let me bring you some sushi." Well, first of all,
you get my question.
He spent his night in jail. He spent his night in jail. And then he wrote about it. And he wrote a famous essay on civil disobedience, and that essay has had almost unbelievable influence. I mean, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, some of the great revolutionaries in world history have said that Thoreau was right, that civil disobedience, not burning down the post office, not attacking people in the streets, but withdrawing your consent from a bad system and calling attention to that withdrawal, but not using violence, is the way to change the world. And this was the jury is still out on this, but Gandhi changed a world of more than 1 billion people by following Thoreau's advice, and self-consciously said that it was Thoreau who had taught him the way. And Martin Luther King, one of the most extraordinary men who ever lived in American history, based a good deal of his nonviolent confrontation with bigotry and racism on Thoreau's essay. So you can say, well, one night in jail doesn't seem like a big deal, but much has come of this, and it has given confidence to generations of people who realize that you can slow down or stop a system that's not working without taking your pitchfork or musket into the street. And you know, the Tea Party is one expression of that in our time. The Occupy movement is another. But there are lots of people who want to show profound disenchantment with a system who choose to follow Thoreau's path. And so I wouldn't belittle it just because it was just kind of a silly one night in the jail and his aunt bailed him out.
Okay. But people that have followed him have paid dearly for that.
How so?
Well, I mean, Martin Luther King and Gandhi, and so.
Well, it's,
you know, their lives became, although they represented much that became good in the end, they suffered terribly to get to that point. Thoreau didn't suffer a lot.
okay. If that's your point, that how much did he ever suffer? You're absolutely right.
Okay. Let's go on.
Moving on. here's Walden Pond. How many of you have been to Walden Pond? You've not been?
I've not been.
Yet to come. But it's in Concord. It's right outside of Concord. It's pretty well developed now. And there are suburban housing subdivisions and so on. But still, you can get there and you can walk around the path. I've gone there 4 or 5 times. The last time I went was with my mother. And it is charming, even though it's now embedded in a very large conurbation. But it's been kept to a certain degree pristine, and if you look in the right direction, you can still see many of the things that Thoreau saw. This is his own map of Walden. There are long chapters in this book that are really just nature writing, and he wanted to find out. The local legend was that the lake was bottomless, the pond was bottomless, and he proved in the winter using a plumb line on ice that it wasn't bottomless, and these are his soundings. This is the famous passage. I mean, if Walden is your desert island book, as it is mine, this is the passage of passages where he explains his mission. And it seems to me that if we all memorize this, that we would be an infinitely better people. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life, living is so dear, nor to practice resignation unless it were quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, and drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. And if it proved to be mean, then to get all of its true and genuine meanness and publish its meanness to the world. Or, if it were sublime, to know that by experiment, and to be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion. I mean, what could be better than that? I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach. I don't know of a single passage in American literature, broadly defined, that is more profound than that, whether you ever go to the woods or not. I mean, what he's saying is that you need to reduce life to its lowest terms. You need to figure out what's the essence of being alive on Earth, and then when you figure that out, you need to use that knowledge, that wisdom, to plan the way you go about your existence, politically, socially, romantically, in friendships, in your career. And that if you don't, then you are settling for not living close to the marrow of life. And that if the closer you get to the marrow of life, the more satisfying life on Earth can be. And so that's what he was doing here. Let me just go on to this. This is a wonderful picture, historic picture of Walden, but this is the usual attack on Thoreau. This is, you see the 7-Eleven? Unbeknown to others, Thoreau would sometimes in the middle of the night sneak out for a few odds and ends. And the usual, when I taught this as a professor, my students would always say the same thing. Well, his mother was doing his laundry back in town. The cabin is only 1.5 miles from Concord. He went in to have dinners with Emerson and the Alcotts and everybody else all the time. He was a part-timer at this cabin. He could go in and bring food back whenever he wanted to. In what sense is this a noble experiment in wilderness life? And you've all heard this, and some of you feel it, that somehow discredits what Thoreau was doing, but that's not what he was doing. This is a cheap shot about Thoreau that's very widely repeated, and this is from a blog that I found yesterday while working on this. This is somebody who's been there and finds the same fault. Visiting Walden, in which our transcendentalist hero is revealed to have lived quite close to town, and by extension his mother's home cooking and weekly goodie baskets of pastries, donuts, claims historian Richard Zacks, casting his great experiment in the wilderness as more of a Boy Scout campout than an expedition of a solitary pioneer. The important thing to remember is that's not what he was doing. He's not John Muir. we see this through the lens of John Muir, that we wish Thoreau had gone out into the Sierra Nevada and lived all alone for 3 years and eaten nothing but grubs or whatever he could process himself and have no tie to the industrial paradigm. That's not the experiment that he's engaged in. So the only way to understand this book is to look at the experiment that he was engaged in. So let's go to that. This, in my opinion, is what he was trying to do. Number one, determine what are our grossest groceries. I'll come back to these. Number two, an attempt to see what simplifications can liberate the life of the soul. Number three, to study himself and mankind and civilization through the lens of nature. And number four, to learn to live deliberately. We've already quoted that passage. So let's go through them one by one. In the chapter that trips most people up is the first chapter, economy, and in it he raises the following question, Larry. He says, what are your grossest groceries? So I'm just going to ask all of you, and I don't mean it rhetorically, what are your grossest groceries? If you took out a piece of paper when you got home tonight and wrote the things you can't live without, the things you absolutely have to have, what would they be? And then you could start a list on the other side, things that you could quite easily live without. For example, an iPad you could live without. An electric lawnmower you could live without, etc. I mean, you can make your own list, but on one side, make your list of things you absolutely have to have, and then on the other side, make a list of things that you know you could live without. Thoreau wants to ask a series of questions about that. First of all, he says, well, you have to have food. We all agree on that. You have to have water. You have to have shelter. You have to have clothing of some sort. And then he says, well, after that, it starts to get a lot harder, because once you have those things, there's not much you have to have after that. Now you're getting into the optional world of things that's fun to have or desirable to have or comfortable to have, but they're not things that you have to have. And so then he says, first of all, do you agree with me? And not everyone would. We would say, well, you have to have a car, you have to have electric lighting, but let's just say we could agree with Thoreau that there's a very short list of things you have to have. And he would say, well, how many weeks per year do you have to work to have those? And it turns out, not many. If we all lived in modest dwellings, and we ate simple food, and we bought durable, simple clothing, or made it ourselves, we probably could all live on $11,000 per year, or who knows what you would say, but some relatively low amount. He says, okay, so once you've made your list, then ask yourself how many days you have to work to get those things. And he says, and of course this will seem ludicrous to us, he says you should be able to get all the things you have to have by working 6 weeks per year. He said, then if you continue to be disciplined and live simply, that leaves 46 weeks per year for the life of the soul. But he says that's not what people in America do. Instead of just sort of getting what they have to have and then maybe a few other things like a few books, a blank journal, pen and ink, whatever, we Americans start to proliferate things we think we have to have, and so in doing so we're enslaving ourselves, because now we're not working 6 weeks per year, we're working 12 weeks per year, and then it's up to 17 weeks, and now it's 42 weeks, and pretty soon, if you're like me, you actually work every week per year and you're still falling behind. And Thoreau says, what are you doing? Because all you really have to have are your grossest groceries. And if you would pare down, make those simple and wholesome, and then pare down all the desirabilities that you don't actually need, but you have convinced yourself or your social culture has convinced you that you want, you would liberate yourself from debt, anxiety, mortgages, both people in a marriage working all the time, all the physical disease that comes with this kind of anxiety-based consumerist culture. So he says, why are you doing it? Why do you want a house that's 6,000 square feet? Why do you want a 4-car garage? Why do you want a boat that you use for 3 weeks per summer and then the rest of the year you worry about it? He said, why don't you kind of rethink your life and ask yourself, What do I really have to have, and then what are the handful of things that I really want beyond grossest groceries, and then calculate, is it worth it? So for example, let's say that I want a second home in Tucson. And it's great because then in the darkest parts of the winter I can go down there and it's terrific for holidays and so on. Thoreau would say, okay, what's the real cost of that? How much of your life's work and your soul's work did you have to give to have that place? And if when you've done the equation you decide that it was worth it, fair enough. But if you realize that really that's an enormous amount of cost of your time and your soul and your life's energy for a very small payoff, then get rid of that house. Get rid of the third car. And get rid of the stuff that's in your closet that you're never going to use again, and on and on and on. You see the argument. So the basic argument that he's trying to raise in Walden is, what are your grossest groceries, and how much of your life do you want to give to the things that are not necessary?
Mm-hmm. Now, let's admit that there are folks that have lived this way. You know, the Ubermensch living in a cave someplace, the hermits that live in caves, in monasteries, the Carthusians. I mean, all of these folks have basically done that, right?
Yeah.
So the question is then, is Thoreau saying that we should do this, or is this an academic and philosophical discussion?
No, he means it. I mean, he doesn't mean that you, Larry, should live in a hut. He thinks you would be better off if you lived in a hut, but it's not for him to decide. I mean, he explicitly says, it's not for me to decide, Larry, but that you need to be honest about what this is costing and how much you have to give up in order for that to be the case. And so he just wants people to be more conscious, more aware of the connection between the things we think we need and our real needs. And his point basically is that Americans spend so much of their time getting and accumulating and amassing and storing and having, garage sales to get rid of last year's stuff, that we're not spending any time on poetry, hiking, real conversation, philosophy, art, that by throwing our energies that way, we're not making ourselves happy, we're really just burdening ourselves, and meanwhile we're using up the little life we get in the wrong direction. But he would say to you, as long as you do the calculations and you decide that it's a bargain, it's okay if you want to spend 50 weeks per year working, but then don't whine about it either.
So it's not necessarily a prescription for how one should live their life, it's a prescription for how one should evaluate their life.
Exactly. And that's why people go back to that 7-Eleven thing and say, well, I mean, he wasn't really living this life either.
Yeah.
He's trying to reduce the number of things he has to worry about, see what life in its lowest terms actually looks like. And for him, it worked. And it was a different era, but it worked. So that's number one. Number two, what kind of simplifications can liberate the work of the soul? It's related to the first one, but it's less economic. It's sort of, where do you want to put your soul's energy? If you really want to be, a ceramicist, then you probably want to reduce some expenditures in other places so you can focus your weekends or your time on that. But you need to make priorities of what really matters to you. And his view is the more you simplify, the more it liberates the poetic side of the soul. Number three, to study yourself and mankind through the lens of nature. And so this book is filled with nature descriptions. Snowflake one is not in this book, but it's typical of Thoreau. He's constantly writing about nature, but what makes it, some people, I'm one of them, I don't have a large appetite for pure nature writing. I like it in small doses. But when it has a moral, when it's pointing to something, when there's an analogy to human choice, then it's more interesting to me. And so Walden is a sort of it's like a 500-page biblical parable. And the parable always has a meaning, and Thoreau is trying to teach you that meaning by showing analogies in nature. And one of the things he wants to do is to break down the chain of being. It's our habit in Western civilization to regard humankind at the top of the chain of being and fundamentally different from everything else. And Thoreau says in a number of chapters in Walden, the more you actually look at the natural world, the less difference there is between us and muskrats, between us and antelope, between us and moose, between us and ants. And he keeps looking at these. There's a famous mock epic scene where he looks at a battle of red ants versus black ants. It's a wonderful passage. It's mock heroic. But he basically says that their wars are no different from ours, and that our self-aggrandizement that humans are somehow an exceptional species is not really true. We're just a species with different ways and means, but the more you look at the continuum of nature, the more it places you in that continuum, and this is a good way of getting sane, because it's the way humans have detached themselves from nature, which has made us so violent and so urbane to the point of decadence. So nature becomes the analogy. The more you look at nature, the more you place yourself in a world where you would be a saner human being. And then finally, living deliberately. So, today the people in the audience made a deliberate choice to come hear us and not watch the football game, to come out on slippery roads and not stay home. I make a deliberate choice to watch the Kardashians and not PBS. But
have you ever actually done that?
Yes. My daughter, unfortunately, loves the Kardashians, and so I've watched a fair amount of it, and it does appear to me to be the death of civilization. But people make their choices, but what he says, it's not so much the choice you make, it's the deliberateness with which you make choices. And he sees us as automata. And of course, maybe the most famous of all of the sentences in Walden is, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." That we're basically sleepwalking through life, miserable, not on top of our souls. Our souls are embers that are about to go out. We are going through the motions of life on earth, and it's not satisfying, and it's not poetic, and it's not intimate, and we're just sleepwalking, and because we're not living deliberately. And so he says the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. He wants us to wake up and make conscious choices about what we care about.
On that quotation, he says it's not resignation. And why does he make a differentiate? Why does he differentiate between desperation and resignation, do you think?
I don't know. I mean, desperation is a strong term, quiet desperation. I think he uses them not necessarily interchangeably, but in the same kind of zone that, I think and maybe this is true, look at the way we feel about our politics now. So is it going to be Newt Gingrich or Mitt Romney? Is it going to be whoever wins there, or Barack Obama? The whole country feels, I think, a sense of disillusionment with this whole process. Like, is this the best we can do as the world's leading republic? And so I think that's resignation. Resign that the system is what it is and there's nothing you can do about it. But Thoreau says if everyone in this room, there are 100 people in the room today, or 80 people, if everyone in this room woke up, we could revolutionize the world. All we have to do is wake up and get out of the sleepwalking that we're in. And there's a famous passage where he says, if you have to have an alarm that wakes you in the morning, you are not fully alive. You should retool your life so that you wake up spontaneously when the sun rises in the morning, and you want to sing like a meadowlark when the sun comes up. You need to be that alive, that present, that conscious. And if this room were filled with those people, we'd sweep away all the rotten systems that are in front of us. Do you believe that?
It's a great looking crowd. I'd buy that.
No, truly.
This crowd.
Do you believe that he's right, that if we woke up, you don't? Why?
It would take more than this room waking up. In fact, I know it's true that one individual can make a difference, but I don't know we could take 80 of us here and we wake up here and we're going to change what you were talking about. You and I just finished reading Friedman and Mendelbaum's newest book, and I recommend it to anybody. That Used to Be Us, which talks about how now we look around the world and we see how great Finland is doing, how great China is doing, how great India is doing, and that used to be us, but it's not anymore. And that to me is resignation as the country, and I just don't know if 80 of us waking up is going to change
you may be
that.
right, but he's more optimistic than you are, because he believes that waking up is a revolutionary act. It's not just like squeezing a little more joy out of life. Everyone in this room has a working acquaintance with 10 people, 20 people, 50 people, your family, your cousins, the people you work with, the people in your reading group or your social clubs or your bridge club, or the people you work out with at the Y. And so everyone in this room has a large number of a circle. And some of the circles overlap, but some of them are very different. And Thoreau's view is if everyone in this room woke up, and I don't mean that you aren't, I mean, I'm just using Thoreau's language here, that would automatically touch off trouble in all of your circles. People will say, what's going on with Ralph? And then they would wonder, well, why does he look so much healthier? Why does his skin so much clearer? Why has he lost weight? Why is he singing when he comes into work in the morning? Why is he telling us that he's suddenly bought canvas and oil paints? And last week he was out camping in the winter at Botano, and you know, his marriage seems to be perking up. And I mean, that's what happens. And then people think, whoa, I want some of that. You know, where do you buy that? And then he says, oh, you can't buy it. You can watch television till the end of time, but there's not a product that you can buy. It's about deciding you're going to be a complete and serious human being. And I think that's his point, is now you're going to say, well, that's awfully optimistic, isn't it? You know, I can hear you sneering at this already, but that's his point, that if one person in this room woke up, it would change people around them. And I mean, this is true. I've seen people in my life in Bismarck who are so much more awake than I am, and when I see them, it's like a sad mirror. Mm-hmm. You don't feel that?
Oh no, absolutely.
And when I see it, I think, so that's what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
That's why, I mean, you could just see, it's a kind of, what Thoreau would call a kind of higher fitness. It's not the kind of fitness you get from working out on a treadmill, although that can help. It's a higher fitness where your life has a more cosmic integrity, and everything works together, and you're not just putting, stuffing box macaroni and cheese in your mouth as you leave the house to drive your car to the gym. That there's some sort of a percolating integrity that makes you a more extraordinary human being, and people around you are going to be shamed by that or inspired by that, and so on.
But how do we create that across society? As opposed, I mean, there are individuals, as you know, that do this, and there are people. I've got friends that do centering, which is kind of the same thing, is to sort of get rid of everything else and center on what it really means to be alive and to be who you are and all this and how you fit into the universe. But how do you make that an epidemic that all of society then wants to be awake? All of society wants to change the resignation or the desperation, whatever we're feeling in this country right now.
Well, I don't think Thoreau has the answer to that, and his society didn't change because of his work. His books didn't sell. There's a famous joke about A Week on the Concord in Merrimack, his first book. Thoreau had written it, and Emerson, he couldn't find a publisher to publish it, and Emerson finally said, why don't you just publish it yourself? And so Thoreau did. He had 1,000 copies printed, and they didn't sell. And eventually the printer brought them to his house in Concord and just put them on the porch because they were tired of having the inventory. And so for the rest of his life, Thoreau said, I have a library of 1,000 volumes, 900 of which I wrote myself. So it didn't work, and maybe it doesn't work. But his point of view, I think, would be you'd be nuts not to try.
Right.
And
right.
Meanwhile, you get to live a life of balance and integrity and higher consciousness, and so in a sense, that's enough. It'd be great if your children and spouse and cousins and work people all joined you, but if they don't, meanwhile, you are this being, and so.
I'm with you on that.
And a time that you don't yet know will recognize you. 200 years from now, they'll say, oh, Scogan was the only one alive in Bismarck.
Let's go.
Yeah. Yeah, you just want to sneer.
No.
This is Walden. If you've been to Walden recently, this is the recreation. I don't like it because I think that it's way nicer than the cabin was, for one thing. And I don't like these kind of recreations anyway. It'd be like creating the Elkhorn Ranch house out on Roosevelt's property. But this is the size that it was. It never looked this good. I can assure you he built it himself. This is a statue of Thoreau, but if you go to Walden, there's an interpretive center. This is a historic photograph of the pond. This is an even more idealized version of what, it's a painting of what the cabin must have looked like. This is the actual site of the cabin. I'm against this too. I don't know why they had to mark it off, but that's where it was, and you can walk around the lake on a path that he often used. This is the same thing at a slightly different era. We'll go quickly through this, but one of the appeals of Thoreau has always been to young people. It's a young person's book. Young people read it and it empowers them to, it was certainly true of the 60s during the Vietnam era when the book had a huge following in America. I just have a couple of his sayings here. Let's do this one. Beware of all enterprises that require new clothes. That's a mirror you might want to look into, Larry. If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music he hears, however measured or far away.
Which was very popular during the Vietnam.
That was almost the anthem of that generation. Yeah. As long as possible, live free and uncommitted. You know, just think of the young people who threw that sentence in their parents' faces. I'm not getting a job. I don't have to go to college. Thoreau says I should stay free and uncommitted. It is never too late to give up our prejudices. No way of thinking or doing, however ancient, can be trusted without proof. What everybody echoes or in silence passes by as true today may turn out to be falsehood tomorrow. Mere smoke of opinion, which some had trusted for a cloud that would sprinkle fertilizing rain on their fields. What old people say you cannot do, you try and find that you can. Old deeds for old people, and new deeds for new. So those and many other statements from Walden have been kind of an anthem of youthful rebellion, and that's been one of the mainstays of the book's success. But what I find in reading it as a middle-aged man is that it speaks to me in an entirely different way. You know, that long since I've ceased to be free and uncommitted, but the book has things that speak to people of any age about the choices that you make. Here's his famous book, that's the frontispiece of it. Here's his first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack. Here are the journals. The journals, you see 14 volumes, so not for the faint of heart. This is a box that is said to be the chest that he kept his journal in. I know people, Larry, who work as itinerants in the national park system. And they're leading a very Thoreauvian life. They go from park to park, so they get a 6-week thing at Rocky Mountain National Park, and then they get a 1-year thing at Canyonlands, and then maybe 2 weeks at Glacier, and then they go to India for a while or something, and then they come back and they work at Big Bend National Park, but they spend their lives as low-paid itinerants in the national park system, and they're living a Thoreauvian life. It's sort of hand-to-mouth. They're not, you know, they don't have a 401k plan, and they're not investing for future economic success or retirement. But I know one guy named Rick, and I went to visit him at a cabin smaller than Thoreau's in Rocky Mountain National Park, and he had this little tiny shelf above the fireplace, and the only books that he had were the 14 volumes of Thoreau's journals. And that's all he did by way of reading, which of course is a great thing to do. This is an actual page from the journals, his handwriting. Anyway, so we should look at another passage.
Okay.
So you nominated some passages.
What do you have now?
You want to see this?
Well, what's next?
You sure you want to see this? Okay, this is...
This is always dangerous for me.
Well, just tell the story. You tell the story.
Okay,
This is my living room above my fireplace. So.
This is Clay's living room, and right above his fireplace, this is engraved. And first, two sides to this story. One that I will tell you, I walked in there, and just so you know, Clay's living room, I mean, you're not living very close to the bone, by the way. You've got a very nice living room with built-in shelves and lots of books, marvelous books. But right above the fireplace is this, with one of those little step ladders that you roll around, you know, it's pretty nice.
Very Thoreauvian, yes.
So I walked in and I said, Clay, it's obvious to me that there's no Mrs. Jenkinson. And he said, well, why? And I said, because there's not a man in the world that could get away with this, turning the living room into a library, right?
That's what you said.
Well, it's true.
Yeah.
So at any rate, but then I looked above the fireplace and I saw this quotation. Now this is just a quick personal side note on this. I was amazed. I retired from the Air Force in 2001.
After what, 20-some years?
26 years.
Yes.
And 2001, and when you retire, they've got a little retirement ceremony, and they actually put together a little program, and it's got your history, your military history in there, and you can, a couple pictures of you in uniform, and you can put anything else that you want in this program. So I put a quotation in that program, and this is the quotation that I had in the program in
Same
2001.
one. From the conclusion, from the last
Yes.
chapter
So-
of Walden.
So we just thought that was very interesting, and we met in 2007 or 8,
When you first moved here.
and to walk into his house and find out that he has the same quotation above the fireplace that I had in my program when I retired from the military, which is why we've become such wonderful.
That was it?
That was it.
I learned this at least by my experiment, that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. And that was on your retirement
That was
thing.
on my retirement.
This is, I'll just tell one quick story about this. Is actually a painting by Leon Bassler of Bully and Butte in the Little Missouri River. But for this, when I moved in, I hired this cabinet maker to do all these shelves and so on. And he was very suspicious. And he said, "You want shelves in every room?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Do you ever plan to sell this house?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, I'm going to make some of them permanent and some of them I'm going to bolt to the wall so the next people can get rid of all this stuff." So anyway, he very reluctantly did all this. And then in the end, I didn't even tell him towards the end. I said, "I want you to create this saying for me above my fireplace." And he said, "Okay." He looked into it and he came back with a proposal and so on. So I emailed him the saying as I was leaving town, and he was going to have this etched or sandblasted or something. And I came back and it was up on the wall, right where you see it now, but there was a typo. There was a typo, Larry, and he said, I learned this at least by my experiment, that if one advanced confidently in the direction of his dream. So I came in and I was bleary from some 2-week trip I'd been on. I looked at it and I thought, oh God, I'll bet I mistyped it when I emailed it. And now I'm going to have to live with this for the rest of my life, with a typo because of my own un-Thoreauvian haste and not living deliberately. You know, what could be worse? So I wrote to him and I said, "Dear so-and-so, I just noticed that there's a typo in this thing. Would you send me my original text, because my fear is that I must have sent you the wrong text." And he wrote back and said, "No, you sent me the correct one." And so then I thought, So I said, "Were you going to tell me?" He said, "No, not if you didn't notice it." So he had to come strip it off, and then he was mad at me, like, who cares if it's a present or past tense? Yeah. So anyway,
Okay.
So that's one of the things that we share is this.
we do.
And do you believe this? If you advance.
Do I believe this? Yeah. Actually, the full quotation, I think I've got the full quotation.
Yeah, you've got
here.
it on the sheet that everyone has.
I'll tell you which one it is. Oh, number 5.
On the Skogan list.
On the Skogan list, yeah.
Right, okay. Let's look at it. So I'll do the first one and then you pick it up, okay?
All right.
"I learned this at least by my experiment, that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours.
He will put some things behind, will pass an invisible boundary. New, universal, and more liberal laws will begin to establish themselves around and within him, or the old laws be expanded and interpreted in his favor in a more liberal sense, and he will live with the license of a higher order of beings. In proportion as he simplifies his life, the laws of the universe will appear less complex, and solitude will not be solitude, nor poverty poverty, nor weakness weakness. If you have built castles in the air, your work need not be lost. That is where they should be. Now put the foundations under them." I love it.
Is that great?
I love it. On another personal note, I must tell you that my son and daughter-in-law were married, I guess it's 2 summers ago, I'm thinking 2 summers ago, and I got to perform their wedding ceremony. I didn't know you could do that. In the state of Colorado, you can. Anybody can perform.
Any college president can?
Thank you, Clay. But at any rate, so as part of the service, I read that to them because I think that is just such a remark. You can build those castles in the air. Then you just have to put the foundations under them. And so that was very meaningful.
Well, you're certainly doing it at Bismarck State. I mean, everyone gets that, and that's a tremendous,
thank you.
Tremendous motto for your own work. I wanted to just kind of maybe point to the difference between us here. Here's me, Larry. And this is, Walden for me is a mirror that you hold up. And I just took this picture this morning in the mirror to show you how I react to this book. It's a mirror which we are invited to ask ourselves questions about whether we are leading lives of integrity, purpose, thoughtfulness, and magnanimity. It's a mirror that invites us to scrutinize our habits, choices, and values and place in the larger society around us. It is, in short, a book that makes demands on us and insists that we begin to live according to higher laws. And you see, I'm not.
You're looking very perplexed there.
Because that's what this book does for me. Here's you. Here's you putting.
Have you ever been on a Segway?
No.
Oh, they're marvelous.
But see, literally, it's a joke, but you are very progressive in the sense that you're pretty happy with technology and you believe that the world is advancing in a better direction. And when you look in that mirror, and I don't mean any disrespect, but you see a lot to be cheerful about.
Okay.
But
where did you get that picture, by the way?
I didn't take it, Larry. Where was this?
You didn't take this?
I did not take this photo. No. I got this on the internet.
Now you're kidding.
No, have you, let's just go into kind of a courtroom. Have you or have you not been on one of these things?
I have, in fact, been on a
Where
Segway
was
a couple of times. One was in Texas, but I think, this looks like a chamber event here in town.
It does have that look.
It does have that look. Yeah. So I think this was at a chamber event.
And are you delivering drinks or?
No. I'm just I was demonstrating my skill on a Segway.
Me?
Yeah.
You?
Yep. Yeah. I think we'd all agree with that.
Okay, before we should take some questions.
Oh, okay.
But we need to look at a couple more passages.
Yeah.
So pick another one from your list.
Well, we've already done number 2. I like number 3.
Okay. 3 is page 2 of your handout. Okay.
No, let's go to number 4.
Number 4, okay.
Because we can talk about number 3 when we're talking about this
Yeah.
other topic. So, number 4. A single gentle rain makes the grass many shades greener, so our prospects brighten on the influx of better thoughts. We should be blessed if we lived in the present always and took advantage of every accident that befell us, like the grass which confesses the influence of the slightest dew that falls on it, and did not spend our time in atoning for the neglect of past opportunities, which we call doing our duty. We loiter in winter while it is already spring. In a pleasant spring morning, all men's sins are forgiven. Such a day is a truce to vice. While such a sun holds out to burn, the vilest sinner may return. Through our own recovered innocence, we discern the innocence of our neighbors.
That's wonderful.
Beautiful passage. And elsewhere he talks about this too, and that's living in the present always. In another passage, he talks about there's a very thin line between the past and the future. And our objective is to live on that very thin line, living in the present. Not
the nick of time, he calls it the nick of time.
Nick of time.
And he takes that cliche, we did it just in the nick of time, and he says, no, you need to live in the nick of time, between the eternal past and the eternal future, and not spend your time looking backward or looking forward, but to be fully present in the existing moment. And he, again, this is Eastern philosophy that's informing him. There's a sort of a koan in Eastern philosophy that this is the only moment you will ever get, right now. This is it. So this moment, there will be in other moments, but if we aren't fully present in this moment, it doesn't matter what the other moments will be. So the statement is, this is the only moment that you will ever have, and you need to be fully present in it. That's very hard to do.
It is.
Let's just quickly look at one of mine. This is from number 1. This is one of my very favorite passages in all of Thoreau. This is about his life with respect to the lake. And I'm sort of more a river person than a pond person. North Dakota is not a great lake place. Minnesota would be a better place if lakes were your theme, minus the jet skis. But this passage, pick it up in the second paragraph, this is just about as good as anything in Thoreau. In warm evenings, I frequently sat in the boat playing the flute and saw the perch, which I seemed to have charmed, hovering around me, and the moon traveling over the ribbed bottom, which was strewed with the wrecks of the forest. Formerly, I had come to this pond adventurously from time to time in dark summer nights with a companion, and making a fire close to the water's edge, which we thought attracted the fishes, we caught pouts with a bunch of worms strung on a thread, and when we had done, far in the night, threw the burning brands high into the air like skyrockets, which coming down into the pond were quenched with a loud hissing, and we were suddenly groping in total darkness. Through this, whistling a tune, we took our way to the haunts of men again, but now I had made my home by the shore. Can you see that scene? Isn't that a magnificent scene? Throwing the brand up and then it falls in the water, and suddenly after the hiss it's total darkness, and they whistle their way back. Going on, the next paragraph's even better. Sometimes, after staying in a village parlor till the family had all retired, I have returned to the woods, and partly with a view to the next day's dinner, spent the hours of midnight fishing from a boat by moonlight, serenaded by owls and foxes, and hearing from time to time the creaking note of some unknown bird close at hand. These experiences were very memorable and valuable to me, anchored in 40 feet of water and 20 or 30 rods from the shore, surrounded sometimes by thousands of small perch and shiners dimpling the surface with their tails in the moonlight, and communicating by a long flaxen line, his fishing line, and communicating by a long flaxen line with mysterious nocturnal fishes which had their dwelling 40 feet below, or sometimes dragging 60 feet of line about the pond as I drifted in the gentle night breeze. And this is the key passage. And now and then feeling a slight vibration along it, the fishing line, indicative of some life prowling about in its extremity, of dull, uncertain, blundering purpose there, and slow to make up its mind. At length you slowly raise, pulling hand over hand, some horned pout, squeaking and squirming to the upper air. It was very queer, especially in dark nights when your thoughts had wandered to vast and cosmogonal themes in other spheres, to feel this faint jerk, which came to interrupt your dreams and link you to nature again. It seemed as if I might next cast my line upward into the air as well as downward into this element, which was scarcely more dense. Thus I caught 2 fishes, as it were, with one hook. So you just imagine him in the middle of the lake in his wooden rowboat, no metal on it. He's taken the paddle into the boat. It's moonlight, and he's just drifting around in this lake. He's the only person there. And he has a fishing line out, and he's getting into this meditative zone about the universe and all the solar systems and philosophy and the meaning of life, and he's just going into this kind of meditative stage, and then he feels this little twitch on his fishing line, and he realizes that 40 feet below there's some creature that's kind of nibbling around or nudging around his hook. And it takes him away from this cosmogonal meditation back into the earth. Oh, it's just marvelous. I mean, there's nobody who can write like this, ever.
Yeah.
There's one and only one Thoreau, and this book is just filled with passages like this. And you know, what he says something about reading, Larry, that's so important. He says, you need to read a book the way the writer wrote the book. This is not a book you can read like a Danielle Steele novel or even Huckleberry Finn. You can't read it for the plot. You can't read to keep moving. You have to slow down. And he writes passages in the book. I discovered this. It took me this whole last week to read this when I had pressing other things to do. But I didn't want to just wing it. I wanted to read the book again as a middle-aged man. And so I gave myself the time that it takes, and it just consumes you. And you'd read, and suddenly you stop and you think, wow, that is as well said as that idea could ever be said. And then sometimes you're so moved by it that you have to get up. You actually have to get up from wherever you are and walk around because you want to tell somebody. Of course, I'm not calling you at 10 p.m. and saying, Larry, page 12, you know, that's not going to work out very well. But you're just so, it's gotten right into the heart of your soul. But he forces you to slow down. If you try to read to get through it, you can't have that experience. And so the book, you know, when they say the medium is the message or the process is the product, he wrote the book so that you can't enjoy it unless you slow down enough to enjoy it, which is the whole point that he's trying to make about life.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask a question. I'm not trying to blow smoke at you or embarrass you here, but I'm on record as saying that I think you're a great essayist, and I'm sure many of the folks here follow along on your columns and in your writings. How much influence do you think Thoreau's writings have had on your own writings? Your book, Message on the Wind, for example, has many of these same elements.
Let me speak really, really honestly, since you've asked a really honest question. I'm a reasonably good prose stylist, but I can't even think of this question without feeling humiliated, because what I do, I work as hard as I can to do it well, whatever I'm doing, but it is at such a vastly lower plateau of human experience. You know, Thoreau has influenced me deeply as a human being and as a citizen. He's an infinitely better writer than I am. I mean, I'd give anything to be able to write like this. I do my best to, when I'm writing a newspaper column or an essay or whatever, I try to put the reader in the place, just like that scene in the boat, where you can't help but be there. You're there. If you let yourself, you're in that scene at Walden Pond at midnight with the little fishies dimpling the surface. I try to do that as a writer, but of course, for everyone who tries, only 1 in 100,000 or 1 in a million can do it. There's a reason why he's one of the greatest writers who ever lived, and why I write for the Bismarck Tribune. You know, and I'm serious. You know, I want to be really serious about this, but that's my goal, is to put people in the scene, in the Badlands, on the Butte, wherever I happen to be, and to write for that detail. But a newspaper is not the same forum as an intensely private book like this, and you know, you either have it or you don't, and I don't have it. I have some talents, but nothing like this.
Well, I think your book, Message on the Wind, is an excellent book, and I think has anybody else read that book here? Huh?
Let's stay with Thoreau here, shall we? We're running out of time.
Okay.
But you take the point that you have to be, yes. I mean, you can't read Thoreau without being honest, Larry. That's the point. If you read Thoreau without being honest, then you failed. You know, what he's saying is, look in the mirror and see what it really tells you. And so if you're going to, you can't do hype. And when we look around at the political world, you know, whether it's Newt Gingrich and Barack Obama or Rick Berg and Heidi Heitkamp, there's so much bullshit where people are not...
I think we can edit that, Dusty. I don't know.
Where people are not saying what they mean, and they don't even mean what they say. They're just posturing, and it's, you know, Thoreau is saying, hey, get real. And if you get real, some of the things you have to say are going to be self-disappointments. You can't just be puffing yourself all the time. You have to face life as it actually is, and that's the key. Again, this is a thought that comes from Eastern religious traditions, but facing the truth about yourself is the key to insight and to growth. And as long as you think, oh, I'm pretty good, you're not good at all, and you're not getting better.
Yeah. On that point, there's another quotation I'd just like to go to just quickly, and then we're going to go to this one. But number 6 under the 10 things Thoreau is telling us.
Yours, or your list?
On my
page? That's
sheet.
page 3.
It would be page 3 at the very bottom. And I really like this because exactly what you said about that there's a vast gulf between what people say they believe and what people really believe. And I love this quotation. I believe that men are generally still a little afraid of the dark, though the witches are all hung and Christianity and candles have been introduced. I think that is a great line. You know what it reminds me of? Stephen Hawkins, and most of you may be familiar, the physicist that has, I don't know if it's ALS, thank you. And he's in a wheelchair and he speaks through
one of the greatest geniuses
ever.
Greatest
geniuses. My favorite Stephen Hawkins quotation is, even those that tell us that everything is predetermined, that there is nothing we can do to change any of the order of the universe, look before they cross a street. and so no matter what we say, there's always the reality, isn't there? And the reality in your case that you're talking about is, let's get real, folks. Let's just quit talking about things that we don't really believe because there's some sort of agenda or there's some goal that we're going to achieve by doing that we really need to get as close to the bone as we can.
And when you do, it's not always a pretty picture in the mirror. And the mirror is not just your physical condition or your spiritual condition, it's so many other things. You know, when I read this time, you know, a great book is greatly new every time. And so when I read it this time, without wanting to, I read it and I kept, the lens that I was wearing was the lens of the Bakken oil development. Not that I wanted to, because I didn't want that to get in the way of this book, and because this is about something else. But there are so many passages in this book which talk about the Bakken, about politics, about choice, about rhetoric, about the commercialization of our landscape. And when I read it, I was sort of haunted by some of the passages in the book because they're really saying to us, I mean, I wish that every North Dakotan would read this book, beginning with the governor and working our way, you know, down to the kid from Louisiana who's living in a man camp today, and read this book and let this book talk to them and say, it's not that we wouldn't do this. I'm not suggesting that then we wake up and say, oh, we're not going to develop the Bakken. Far from it. But deliberately and no BS, to tell the truth about what's out there and to face it truthfully and manfully or responsibly, and not just let rhetorical bromides and talking points and pablum serve as our discourse about it. And if you saw, there was this extraordinary article by a woman up in Crosby, the editor of the newspaper there, a cry for help, saying, we're being destroyed, we're being overwhelmed by this. And the response by officials in industry and elected officials was to say, oh, it's all going to be okay. But I don't think that's the right response. I think when someone in the field there is crying for help and saying, this is out of our control, we're worried about whether we can keep our communities, I think our responsibility is to say, we're listening. And that's what Thoreau is talking about. It's not that you say, oh, well, we're not going to do any of this. It's we're going to do this deliberately and with a virility of integrity and truthfulness and no hype. And so this is a hard book. This is a book that makes serious demands on the reader. But I would hope, I mean, if I could ask the people in the audience to do anything, I would say, if you haven't read Thoreau or you haven't read him recently, go out and get yourself a copy of this book and read it, but read it as a self-catechism. Keep a notebook, and every time you come upon a passage which speaks to your predicament or your life, either copy it out or write a note about it. But I took scores of pages of notes reading it this week, and I'd have to get up. I'd think, ooh, that doesn't look too good. Maybe I shouldn't have bought that snowblower. You know, ooh, that doesn't look too good. How many sets of china do you really need? You know, and it was really an instructive. That doesn't necessarily change your life. That's the hard part. Now what? But That's what the book is asking you to do. It's not just a famous nature classic. It's a book that says, how serious are you about your life? So let's go to this.
Let's go to this. Okay, now, to do this, we need to start with one of the quotations here. Number one on my list, I think Clay's got it on his list too, but I'm sure he quoted a lot more than I did, so we'll go to my list.
It's number one on your list.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, let me set this up.
Yep.
The chapter that trips most people up is the first chapter, Economy. And it's a pretty righteous critique of New England capitalist consumer railroad culture in Thoreau's time. And it's kind of, there's a little bit of he's querulous, he's a little whiny about it, he's judgmental, and it rubs a lot of people the wrong way. And a lot of people can't get beyond that first hump in Thoreau to get to the glories that follow when beginning in the chapter Where I Lived and What I Lived For. So you have to sort of discipline yourself to read that first chapter. That's where grossest groceries comes up and how much of your soul time do you have to spend on any given thing and so on. In that first chapter, he also talks about the problems of American education. And he went to Harvard, and he did well at Harvard. But he was a critic of Harvard. And so then this passage spoke to the two of us about a year ago, and we then have been thinking about this educational experiment. So here's what he says. If I wished a boy to know something about the arts and sciences, for instance, I would not pursue the common course, which is merely to send him into the neighborhood of some professor, where anything is professed and practiced about the art of life, to survey the world through a telescope or a microscope and never with his natural eye, to study chemistry and not learn how his bread is made, or mechanics and not learn how it is earned, to discover new satellites to Neptune and not detect the motes in his eyes, or to what vagabond he is a satellite himself, or to be devoured by the monsters that swarm all around him while contemplating the monsters in a drop of vinegar. Which would have advanced the most the end of a month? The boy who had made his own jackknife from ore which he had dug and smelted, reading as much as would be necessary for this, or the boy who had attended the lectures on metallurgy at the Institute in the meanwhile and received a Rogers penknife from his father, which would most likely cut his fingers. To my astonishment, I was informed on leaving college that I had studied navigation. Why, if I had taken one turn down the harbor, I should have known more about it. This is a very typical passage from Thoreau. It's kind of snotty, critical, witty. You know, he likes to use those inversions and puns and turn things that we accept as values on their heads and show us the flip side of them. And he actually says at one point, just as an experiment, you should stand on your head for a day and look at the world upside down, because he says it's not just upside down, it's a very different world if you change your perspective. Mm-hmm. So anyway, this is about education.
Right.
So,
and we've had this conversation going on. We both like that paragraph now, so I don't upset anybody. We do outstanding things here at Bismarck State College. I have outstanding professors, and the classes are outstanding. And in fact, we have many, many classes in which students are, in fact, doing a lot of hands-on stuff.
Learning to make their jackknives.
Learning to make the jackknife. So I'm not being critical of that. But we just thought, okay, if you took this paragraph as a start and just built a college based on this paragraph, how might you do it in today's world?
In the 21st century.
Today. How might you do it? You know, we're not going to. So at any rate, and obviously there's a plethora of information out there today. You can gain all kinds of information on the internet. You can read all kinds of books. We have wonderful resources on campus. We have professors in all different disciplines that students could go to and talk to and learn from. And things that we want students to learn are how to communicate, both in writing and verbally, how to communicate, how to collaborate, how do they create teams, and how do they work within teams, and how to be creative, how to ask critical questions, how to create new answers to the questions that they're asking. And so kind of using that premise, we thought, well, this would be kind of fun to create a school that or at least a class that did this. So this is our experiment in doing that with you guys. So you tell them what we did.
So the idea is that in the age of the internet, there is no piece of information that you can't have instantly. Even if you have an iPhone and you want to know what's the highest point in Brazil, you can find that out within seconds. I mean, there's almost no factoid that you can't find instantly now. Now, when I was going to college in the 1970s, that wasn't true. If you wanted to find out what the highest point in Brazil was, you had to go to the library, find an almanac. It might take you half a day. It might take you several days to find that out. The revolution is that now information is all just in this cloud above us, and the Wikipedia I just saw the other day has more than 3 million articles. 3 million. You know, the Encyclopedia Britannica has a couple of 100,000 articles in the expanded edition. 3 million articles and growing. We're just getting started here. There's nothing you can't find out about. So if we take a young woman from Mott or from Mandan or Bismarck, and she comes to Bismarck State, what are we trying to teach her now? Because it's not really about information anymore. She knows how to get that. It's about critical thinking skills, perspective, a grounding. I'm not sure what, but that's the question. And so instead of having a course in world geography, where you study Argentina, and then you study Sri Lanka, and then you study Nigeria, you know, what good is that in the 21st century when all that information is just out there? So how would you change it? So the experiment we wanted to create was a class in which you started with a single photograph of something, more or less at random, and then the class was built around the jackknife principle of not looking at physics, but looking at the physics of what's in the photograph, not looking at economics, but the economic implications of what's in the photograph. So you're solving a practical set of questions, right?
Right.
Okay, so same passage. So what we did was, you took a picture yesterday at noon, randomly. I took a picture yesterday at noon, and our mutual friend and colleague Beverly Everett, who's in the Chesapeake this week, took a picture randomly at the same moment at noon Central yesterday. And your photograph is this, so tell us about this.
Well, first let's look at all three photographs.
Okay, here's mine.
So if we did this, the idea is, okay, you would have your students all take a photograph at a set time, set hour. They've got to take a photograph.
With their phone
they would
or
come
with
to
the digital,
class. Yeah, however they wanted to do it. They would come to class then, and then you would have all these photographs, and you would discuss the photographs. But the most important thing about the photograph would be, how many questions can you ask about that photograph? Is it 40? Is it 400? Is it 5? Whatever it is.
And so just give us one question about this photograph to give
okay,
people
just
a sense
if I were to look at that, when did they start mounting heads to put on a wall?
Right.
When did hunters start doing that?
And when did stores start doing it? But, you know, okay,
Yeah.
so one question is...
Or the gun. You could look at the gun and you could say, what's the history of gunpowder? Where does that come from?
When did we get scopes on rifles?
When did you get, or the electricity? Where does that electricity come? The lights that are up there. Where's that electricity coming from? How is that being generated?
What's on this monitor?
What's the physics to that?
What's on this monitor and how did it come to pass? That's not CNN. That's probably how to cook beef jerky in the field kind of thing. Or how about this, Larry? Why would, was this Shields?
I was in Shields,
You know,
yeah.
why do they have a fake Thoreauvian hut? You know, I mean, they're selling rifles. I mean, why not just put them on a rack? Why is there this, what marketing scheme is this? So you could ask how these price tags got printed. Rifle designs, are these all the same rifle or are these different rifles? Why are there different types of rifles? Why do we have trophies? What's this woman doing? You know, you could go to every object in this and begin to ask a series of questions. You could probably generate 50 or 100 questions from your photograph, right?
Right.
Okay, that's yours. Here's mine, and then here's Beverly Everett's. She's in the Chesapeake. So she just, the deal was noon, you have to take a picture of something in the close range. So she took this and sent it in. I took this, you took this.
Now, what I said after I saw the three photographs is we have death, transportation, and a yuppie.
And which one is the yuppie? So here's her photograph. So do a little with
Oh,
that.
you know, the tires, rubber tires.
Where
does
do
that
we
come
get
from?
rubber?
Where do we get rubber? How's rubber made? What's the chemical composition to make rubber? Bicycle, what's the history of the bicycle? Why do we enjoy having a bicycle that looks like it's made in 1950s?
This is a retro bicycle.
It's a retro bicycle. Why would we do that? Why is that seat missing off of that bicycle?
Beverly stole it, obviously.
Obviously.
Why this was an urban planning system to have a bicycle racks.
Yep. Concrete. What's the composition of concrete?
The landscape gardening here.
Landscape, you know.
How was this poly sign made? What is a game room?
And steel. I mean, I know all of you could look at it and just ask a number of questions.
Okay, but what's the point of this?
Okay. So the point of this is then we would have a class where we would set teams up in the class, and depending on how many you got in there, you know, you have 3 to a team or 4 to a team. And then everybody would take the photographs. They would come with the photographs. You would narrow down the number, the photographs, and you'd be able to switch them out and swap them around. And so you've got one team that has a particular interest, and that team then would end up with photograph A, and another team would end up with photograph B. Then they would have to then, working under some mentors or some
A facilitator
is develop those questions and then go out and get those answers using the resources on campus, using resources on the internet.
The professors,
the
class.
professors, absolutely. You go to the chemistry, you know, if for the bicycle one on the rubber, you might start off, everybody, by the way, most people today start their research on Wikipedia. Even researchers begin on Wikipedia because, and a lot of people don't like how Wikipedia, it's an open source, you don't know if it's, all of it's true, but the point is that it's a good place to start, and then you go from there and you start jumping around off of that Wikipedia.
It's a good starting point for easy reference.
So at any rate, let's just use that one. If the question was,
where's
where's rubber come from? Okay. Where's rubber come from? And then they would be able to do research on that. They'd be able to go to the professors on campus and get information from them.
So let's say you go to the chemistry professor and say, Professor, tell me about rubber. And the professor says, well, interesting, you should ask. Rubber is such and such a compound. It used to be found in trees. And
or would say, you know, the best resource.
Right, or you might want to go read this.
The best resource for finding out where that rubber comes from is to go here and do your research there.
But let's say the rubber comes from Brazil. Then this is the reason for the class is to encourage young people to ask the right questions, because asking the right questions is in a sense more important than the answers in an age where it rains information. So then the question might be, well, if rubber is in Brazil but it's not in California or Arizona or Florida, how do we get it? And what's the economic system that allows it to be economical to develop rubber from trees in Brazil and then send them to the United States for processing? How does that work? And so the professor might say, oh, you want to go to the geography professor. She'll tell you why the geography of Brazil lends itself to rubber trees and the geography of Minnesota doesn't. And so you can see this can go endlessly in any direction.
You could end up in Brazil talking about the destruction of the
rainforest or the rise of the conservation movement and what that has to do with Roosevelt and so on. But this one photograph would probably be provocation for a whole course. A team of 2 or 3 students with a professor, we're going to call her a facilitator, because she's not teaching English anymore. She's not teaching math anymore per se. She's teaching young people how to ask and answer questions, to engage with material. And if these photographs were random enough, it'd cover a whole lot of ground. So, do you want to try this? This is my photograph. So, you know, what's Diet Coke? And what kind of chemical makes your palate believe it's sugar? Sorry? Yeah, who's hiding? I'm hiding, yes.
Oh, up here, yeah.
Yes, yeah, sorry. Yeah,
we get paid, that's our advertising budget.
This is a granddaughter having their Saturday morning coffee. Starbucks, the phenomenon of mass appeal products. Here's my broken down copy of Walden. That's my Starbucks card, Larry. You can go, I mean, just think of this. You can go into Starbucks and hand them a $100 bill, and they'll put $100 of credit on a card, on a piece of plastic, and you can carry it to any Starbucks in the world except Barnes & Noble, and they'll swipe that and give you a drink. Well, that's an act of faith. Think of it, that you allow them to encode that piece of inert plastic with value, and that value then electronically, how does that work? Could you explain that?
No.
No, but that's explainable.
Right.
So you could spend a couple of weeks in the class just explaining how this works, how this was developed electronically in terms of plastic, in terms of our marketing systems. You know, one of the things about this is, one of the hidden truths about these cards, like I buy my daughter a card for Subway sandwiches and put $100 on it. She may lose that card in week 3, or she may forget it until it runs out of oomph, but the companies are making money by pre-selling you these drinks, because the percentage of cards that ever gets fully used up is relatively minor. Anyway, you could spend endless amounts of time on this. Here's
Your
this
Apple
plastic bag.
computer, your Apple, right now I'm reading Steve Jobs' biography. I mean, you could just do a whole class on that, and
So,
computing. And
do you think, I mean, I'm sure we could do this class at Bismarck State, and we could find facilitators maybe in this room who would want to do it. Do you think it would be better than the curriculum that we now have?
Oh, heavens no. We've got the fabulous curriculum. But I think it would be a great experiment, sort of like Thoreau's experiment at the pond. I think it would be a great experiment.
No,
So I think we had, but you know what? We're really running out of time.
Well, let me just ask you one last question.
Are you going to put me on the spot?
No.
Okay.
You took this picture
Yep.
knowing that we were going to talk about Thoreau, and you took a picture of mayhem. You know, and Thoreau is probably not a trophy on the wall kind of a guy. So in our class, do we get to ask about ironic intention?
That'll be for the Freudian class that
Yeah.
we have. Yeah.
But I mean, why did you take that picture and not another picture?
Well, I was actually looking for, I walked around looking for a case that had knives and guns and all that, but it was all segregated out. You couldn't
But what
find
was
it.
your motive here? Was to...
Well, I think it'd be a wonderful discussion, and let's move on.
You see how
Okay.
this works?
We've got a microphone back here.
It's what is it, a quarter to?
It's quarter to. Oh
got-
man, this went like
Man,
that.
well, you were-
Well, it did for us.
Let's see if there are any questions
If there are any questions
or thoughts.
or thoughts or
there's one
whatever,
back
there is
here.
a question over here. And you know, you're free to ask any question of Clay about Thoreau or about the pipeline.
You do realize that this college exists that you're talking about. It's called Evergreen State College in Washington, and this is how they run their classes. They take one class that has kind of a set but nebulous topic. It's worth 16 credit hours per semester, and they do wherever they go.
Same
So
at
it-
St. John's in Santa Fe and Annapolis. You start off in a class and they say, this class is about Shakespeare, and then on day 3, some student raises their hand and says, yeah, but was Shakespeare really Shakespeare? And then the professor says, well, if you want to go down that path, and then they wind up going down all sorts of whimsical paths, but there is some direction to make sure that there's a breadth. So Evergreen is another great example. Reed used to have a very non-traditional curriculum. They're all wonderful schools. Do you have a personal relationship with Evergreen?
Actually, BSC sent me there to go look at the college and
Yeah.
see how they do things.
We did.
So
We
we
had a
could
great
start
visit.
moving the way we teach in this direction. And there's a lot of economic roadblocks to moving into that kind of a system. It's take it down to the floorboards and build it back up again. So,
The
but
hard-
it would be a fabulous way to learn, to let students go off in that direction. However, the students today, a lot of people today have a lot of difficulty being that curious, knowing what questions to ask. Even though they have all this technology at their fingertips, they use it for entertainment more than for satisfaction of curiosity. At least that's been my observation.
But what Thoreau would say to that, Larry, is, at least in this, you're saying this is a real world situation. Why is that scope on that rifle? Why is that television screen in that place? In other words, you're asking things that are not abstract or theoretical or hidebound or dead white males looking at things from a Greek or European perspective. You're looking at a real world situation that is present in the fullest possible way. You took this photograph at a certain time yesterday, and now we're asking questions about the world that they live in, how it works, and the theory is that they will engage with that more than they would with an abstraction like Dante.
Yeah. And to Evergreen, one of the problems, I think, in trying to create something like this, and we saw on our visit to Evergreen, is that the rest of the system, and by that I mean the whole system of higher education, hasn't moved very close to where Evergreen is doing, and I think they're doing marvelous things. But when a student is done there and they want to transfer someplace, somebody has to sit down with every one of their transcripts and explain what this class was about and how many credits they're supposed to get for it. So that 16 hours has to be broken down into
the math component.
The math and the chemistry and the whatever, you know. So it's very difficult.
The system's hidebound, he would say.
Yep. Another question? More. Here's a question down here.
Two.
Oh, we got another. Okay, we'll get a couple.
Then we'll quit.
Yeah.
You discussed Thoreau's idea of the individual economy, or the individual's grossest groceries. What would he say are society's grossest groceries, or that those things that are worth our concerted effort together?
Very good question.
Well, I don't know, because he's less interested in international policy and national policy than he is about the lives of the community of Concord in Massachusetts and the lives of the people that he encounters. And he wants to extrapolate. He's a radical individualist. Let me start that way. Jefferson said, that government is best which governs least. Thoreau said, that government is best which governs not at all. And Jefferson's ideal was the farmer citizen who lives at Monticello or lives in his own modest dwelling, but participates in his community. Thoreau's view is, just leave me alone. I just want to be left alone, and I'll self-actualize, and that'll maybe bleed back, but I don't have any duties particularly in the community except to protest that which I find objectionable. And so it's not quite clear, but I think that what Thoreau would say to us, it sort of goes back to what Larry was saying at the beginning. What's the real cost of oil? Oil is what, $110 a barrel right now, something in that range. That's not the real cost of oil. Thoreau would say the real cost of oil is the size of the U.S. military, which patrols the Straits of Hormuz. It's the wars you've been fighting over resources in the world. It's the air bases you have and other bases across the planet that protect your supply lines. It's the environmental damage, which you have not factored into your consumption. And so he wants you to, grossest groceries for him is an accounting method. It's sort of a moral, environmental, holistic accounting method. Maybe the gas in your tank only costs $3.42 per gallon, but it actually costs $17 per gallon if you factor in the military, the Keystone Pipeline, the cost of all of these things. And so he wants the culture to look at these same questions of grossest groceries. Wouldn't we be better off lowering our consumption by 10% if it meant we didn't have to fight a war in Iraq? Wouldn't we be better off having one car rather than two if it meant that you don't have to work two jobs a couple doesn't have to work two jobs to maintain those payments? And so he wants to extrapolate this equation, this sort of cost-benefit analysis, but to take it beyond pure economics and put it into an environmental sphere, a social sphere, a distributive justice sphere, and a philosophical sphere, and to start finding an accounting method for our souls, at least, that will factor in some of those other costs. And I presume that he would think that the nation could make the same accounting system. The things he attacks in Walden are the railroads. He's not against them, he's ambivalent about railroads, but he realizes that they're sweeping away a certain pastoral part of American life. He's interested in the New England Industrial Revolution, mill culture, and what that's going to mean. The international telegraph systems and internal telegraph systems that were being developed in his time. So he's looking at emerging technologies just as we are, but in a different era.
But he does say the railroad caused punctuality.
Yeah, he's ambivalent about the railroad. Of course, who doesn't like what the railroad can give you? But then his question is, well, where are you riding to? Where do you think you're going? Mm-hmm. What is it that's so interesting about Las Vegas or Portland or Seattle?
Another question?
I really enjoyed listening to this. But I'm wondering about young people and what their motivations are in today's world in terms of attending college and the desire for good jobs that pay. And, you know, all this inquiry is fun for mind games, but how is it going to make me money?
Larry, that's one for you.
That's one for me. Actually, we have a strategic planning process that's ongoing right now, and we're going to have I think it's called a vision conference on Tuesday. And one of the things that I've shared with the folks that are participating in that is a quotation out of this Friedman book that I referenced earlier. And in that, he says about education that there's 2 points to it. One is to get the skills. You got to have the skills, because we're in a highly technical time of our lives. We've never been more technical than this. The skills that's required for, you know, if we want to move to this electric car that runs with a battery that gets plugged in, that's going to take a very special skill set. You're not going to have a backyard mechanic taking care of that. It's going to take a very highly skilled young man or young woman working someplace that can work on that car. And so that's one of the purposes Friedman talks about for education. But then the other purpose is to make them better citizens. That you want them to have critical thinking skills. You want them to be able to communicate. We want them to be able to watch this political process and to use Mr. Jenkinson's word, that is BS, what those people are talking about. We want them to be able to do that. So I think that we, at this college and any college, need to be doing both of those things. We need to be addressing, okay, how do they make a living? Because in the past we came to college to learn to be school teachers or dentists or architects or whatever it might be. And that hasn't changed. You still need to give them the skills so they can go out and work. But we need to continue and maybe recapture that which I think much of society thinks we've lost, and that's those skills of being a good citizen. I don't know. Hope that answers the question. Are there any more questions? Any more thoughts?
Can we just close with...
Okay, let's close with something.
If you would just turn to Death of a Pine, the last of the snowflake, on the flip side of the snowflake. This sort of sums up, I think, a lot of Thoreau's, you know, he's regarded as an early environmentalist, but he's not really an environmentalist in the same sense of the term. He's more of a holistic ecologist, and he wants to ask questions about how we choose in our resource quest. And this passage is from the journals. I just want to read it and have you listen to it, but you can't hear this passage without thinking about the Bakken oil fields and what this is going to mean, both good and bad, for the future of North Dakota. This afternoon, being on Fairhaven Hill, I heard the sound of a saw, and soon after, from the cliff, saw 2 men sawing down a noble pine beneath, about 40 rods off. I resolved to watch it till it fell, the last of a dozen or more which were left when the forest was cut, and for 15 years have waved in solitary majesty over the sprout land. I saw them like beavers or insects gnawing at the trunk of this noble tree, the diminutive mannequins with their cross-cut saw which could scarcely span it. It towered up 100 feet, as I afterwards found by measurement, one of the tallest probably in the township, and straight as an arrow, but slanting a little toward the hillside, its top seen against the frozen river and the hills of Conantum. I watch closely to see when it begins to move. Now the sawyers stop, and with an axe open it a little on the side toward which it leans, that it may break the faster. And now their saw goes again. Now surely it is going. It is inclined 1/4 of the quadrant, and breathless I expect its crashing fall. But no, I was mistaken. It has not moved an inch. It stands at the same angle as at first. It is 15 minutes yet to its fall. Still its branches wave in the wind, as if it were destined to stand for a century, and the wind sows through the needles as of yore. It is still a forest tree, the most majestic tree that waves over Musquiatquid. The silvery sheen of the sunlight is reflected from its needles. It still affords an inaccessible crotch for the squirrel's nest. Not a lichen has forsaken its mast-like stem, its raking mast. The hill is the hulk. Now, Now's the moment. The mannequins at the base are fleeing from their crime. They have dropped the guilty saw and axe. How slowly and majestically it starts, as if it were only swayed by the summer breeze and would return without a sigh to its location in the air. And now it fans the hillside with its fall, and it lies down to its bed in the valley from which it is never to rise, as softly as a feather, folding its green mantle about it like a warrior, as if tired of standing, it embraced the earth with silent joy, returning its elements to the dust again. But hark! There you only saw, but did not hear. There now comes up a deafening crash to these rocks, advertising you that even trees do not die without a groan. It rushes to embrace the earth and mingle its elements with the dust, and now all is still once more and forever, both to eye and ear. I went down and measured it. It was about 4 feet in diameter where it was sawed, about 100 feet long. Before I had reached it, the axeman had already divested it of its branches. Its gracefully spreading top was a perfect wreck on the hillside, as if it had been made of glass, and the tender cones of 1 year's growth upon its summit appealed in vain and too late to the mercy of the chopper. Already he has measured it with his axe and marked off the millions it will make, and the space it occupied in the upper air is vacant for the next 2 centuries. It is lumber. He has laid waste the air. When the fishhawk in the spring revisits the banks of the river, he will circle in vain to find his accustomed perch, and the henhawk will mourn for the pines lofty enough to protect her brood. A plant which it has taken 2 centuries to perfect, rising by slow stages into the heavens, has this afternoon ceased to exist. You can agree or disagree about the politics of something like this, Larry, but the writing is so magnificent that he makes the case for the right of a tree to exist, as well as that case can ever be made. That's the glory of Thoreau. It's whether you agree with him or not, it's the mirror he holds up and says, are you conscious of what you're doing there?
Yep. And if you'd followed that log into the town and seen it sawed and made somebody a home and a beautiful cabinet.
Or the paper that we printed all the time. Yeah, I hear you.
Okay.
I hear
all
you,
right.
of course.
Okay. One last note, you got a, what do we call it?
Evaluation.
Evaluation form when you came in. If you would please fill that out, Robin would be delighted to take them from you. We take seriously thoughts that you have about future programming and how we can improve what we're doing here. And we certainly want to thank all of you for coming today. Appreciate it very much.
On such a glorious New England day.
On a great New England day. Thank you.